Good evening, everybody. We're going to be doing this presentation in English because there's a number of non-Ukrainian speakers, but we wanted to welcome everybody. This is something that I've been dreaming about in terms of getting someone of Yuri's caliber to talk about his work as a Fulbrighter and also as a wood conservator, because what he's doing is just so significant. And we're very honored to have you here today. Thank you for being here. So Yuri Yanchyshyn is the principal and senior conservator of Period Furniture Conservation and Kensington Preservation, LLC, both of which are in metropolitan New York City. And the firms are dedicated to wooden artifact conservation, as well as cultural heritage objects preservation. Yuri holds degrees from the University of Michigan and the California Institute of the Arts. He received conservation training from the Amsterdam Academy for Restoration and the Smithsonian Center for Materials Research and Education. Before the founding of his firms, Yuri worked, I'm out of breath, as a consulting conservator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He has treated wooden objects for more than 40 years and was awarded Fulbright Specialist status in 2018. Teaching wooden artifact conservation at the Lviv Polytechnic National University in Lviv, Ukraine. In 2019, he was awarded Fulbright Scholar status and returned to teach in Ukraine once again. And there are a number of websites where you can view his work and his efforts in Ukraine, and also a very comprehensive presentation of his Fulbright work in 2018 and 2019. So it's under periodfurnitureconservation.com or kensingtonpreservation.com. And I'll have that for you if you're interested. But without much more ado, I'd like to introduce Yuri, who will be talking to us about a very interesting topic, Ukrainian culture at risk again. Thank you.
Ola, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Board of Directors of the Ukrainian American Archives and Museum, as well as the Detroit branch of the Shevechenko Scientific Society, as well as Ola and Zenon Chorny for inviting me to speak today. And of course, it's energizing to see so many familiar faces in the audience from my years of growing up in Detroit. I'm here to talk about the material culture of Ukraine, which is at risk again. The focus of my presentation will be on Ukrainian cultural objects made of wood, my field of expertise, what has been lost and what still exists today is a reflection of Ukraine's vibrant multicultural and multi-ethnic history, such as its wooden churches, or tsarkvas in Ukrainian, Jewish wooden synagogues, walls of icons that separate the altar from the congregation in Eastern Rite Christian churches called iconostasis, Roman Catholic polychrome sculptures, icons, and other wooden artifacts. My talk has several themes. I will begin with a 20th century historical context for the current events. Next slide, please. Highlighting the destruction of Soviet Ukrainian iconostases, Jewish wooden synagogues, and polychrome sculptures in Polish churches during the 20th century. Next slide. Then I will speak of the state of conservation and historic preservation in Ukraine and my work as a Fulbright specialist and scholar. Next slide. I'll focus on the current wartime period and conclude, next slide, with perspectives for the future. The presentation will last approximately 35 to 40 minutes. I will introduce information that may be new to you, so please hold your questions for the end. Next slide. Like many countries, Ukraine has endured a period of cultural heritage destruction. However, the 20th century was particularly devastating to Ukrainian culture since many of those events were the result of purposeful destruction caused by man in contrast to accidental losses due to wartime activity or natural disasters. The first category of such ruination occurred in the 1930s in Soviet Ukraine with the destruction of Ukrainian iconostases. Next slide, please. Pictured here is the earliest and best preserved iconostases in Ukraine in the Paraskeva Church in Lviv, in western Ukraine, dated 1610. In comparison, not a single 17th century iconostasis has survived in eastern Ukraine. As an art form, the iconostasis consists of several tiers of icons, painted wooden panels of religious imagery, with a double-door passage to the altar in the central section, called the royal doors, and single doors on either side, called the deacon's doors. Its origin dates from the 6th century Byzantium, and over time, these initial barriers evolved into the architectural construction we know today. This architectural art form reached its apogee of development in Ukraine during the Baroque period. An example here. Next slide, please.
Should be back.
This image and another that follows are significant because they are rarely seen historic photographs by Stefan Taranushenko, a giant of Ukrainian art history and historic preservation, who traveled throughout eastern Ukraine, photographing its churches. He served time in Chita, on the Russian border of China, on false charges of being a member of a, quote, Russian-Ukrainian fascist bloc, end quote. It is due to his immense archive, which is preserved today, that we are able to see the iconostases close to their original form. During the Baroque period, the tiers of icons in the central portion of the iconostases became elevated. Next slide, please. This, in turn, led to the main form of the iconostases rising significantly, resembling a mountain. Next slide, please. Thus, these Baroque iconostases created a previously unknown impression of commanding monumentality, with many reaching the height of 20 to 22 meters, or approximately 17 stories tall. The decoration of these iconostases, next slide, was elaborate, evolving into dense carvings with gilded and sometimes silvered flowers, next slide, with lush acanthus leaves and vines. These carved floral motifs were not only three-dimensional, but they were often mounted in 2 layers. Next slide, please. In the iconostases' lower tiers, here. As a result, the iconostases began to take on the form of an open, pierced, gilded curtain, rivaling the greatest carvings of the period. Losses of Soviet Ukrainian iconostases, whether of the Baroque or later Classical period, due to the natural aging or stylistic replacements, were minimal up until the time of the Soviet era of the 1930s. At that point, this art form became the epicenter of Soviet governmental anti-religious initiatives. Churches were closed and services were forbidden due to activities of the Communist Party of Ukraine, which promoted the phrase, quote, opium of the people, end quote, in numerous party publications. The destruction of the iconostases, next slide please, soon followed. Here you see the fencing off of an iconostasis before dismantling by the Communist Party members. This image, next slide please, documents the actual dismantling. Very preliminary statistics numbering about 400 document how many of these iconostases and their icons were cut into pieces and burned. This destruction was not only limited to the iconostases, but included Torah arcs of Jewish synagogues and the carved altars of Roman Catholic churches as well. During this period, a minimal number of icons and individual carvings were saved by museum staff members as examples of icon painting styles or the history of the decorative arts. Any reference to the destruction of these masterpieces in Soviet publications was strictly censored. When World War II began, most iconostases of Eastern Ukraine were destroyed, and any surviving members were heavily damaged during the war. Only 7 18th century Baroque iconostases miraculously survived in various states of damage. Governmental conservation institutions restored these iconostases from the late 1960s to the early 1990s. One such surviving example, next slide please, is the Sorochinsky iconostas in 1731 to 1732 in the village of Veliki Sorochinsky, Poltava region, built by Hetman Danilo Apostol. This image does not do justice to the scale of this iconostasis, since it is photographed with a wide-angle lens due to it being so large. A second category of obliteration, next slide please, was the near complete destruction of Jewish wooden synagogues by the occupying Nazi regime during World War II. A prime example of that art form, next slide please, was a 17th century synagogue in the western Ukrainian located city of Gvizdets, or Polish Wojciech, in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. This particular synagogue and a portion of the village had been destroyed earlier during the 1914 Austro-Hungarian and Russian hostilities. Still, I have chosen to focus on it due to its extensive surviving documentation and as an example of the large wooden synagogues that were completely destroyed during the Second World War. Dated to 1640 during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, next slide please. It had a rectangular floor plan, a log and pillar structure, and an interior dome vault. Although possessing an unassuming character from the outside, it had extensive interior polychrome. Next slide, please. It was painted after 1652 by Isaac, son of Mordecai Lesnicki, from Novye Yarechi, and Isaac, son of Rabbi Yudah Leib HaKohen. The ceiling, interior, and walls were covered with detailed and brightly colored images depicting Hebrew inscriptions and vibrant animal figures set against dense vegetative backgrounds. Here is a photograph, next slide please, of the bima, the raised platform from which the Torah is read. These photographs were taken in the early 20th century by Alwa Briere, an artist and photographer, right before the synagogue's destruction. This is fortunate, since this documentation served as a basis for reconstructing the interior dome ceiling of the roof and bima, next slide please, by Rick and Laura Brown of Hand House Studios in Massachusetts. The reconstruction is now located in the Poland Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, Poland. A validating aspect of this reconstruction process was that Nick and Laura, whom I met, visited St. George's Tzarkva in Druhovich, which we will come to shortly, to research the wall coloration and painting techniques that were used at that time. Today, next slide please, only the synagogue's foundations are left. No tablet or marker informs a viewer of its significance. A third category, next slide please, of purposeful destruction occurred after World War II in the western Ukraine with the closing of Roman, Greek Catholic, and Orthodox churches and any Jewish masonry synagogues which had not been destroyed due to the once again anti-religion policies of the Soviet government. These places of worship were transformed into storage facilities or repurposed for other activities. This contemporary image, next slide please, is of the Pantelimon Church in Shevechenko in the Halych region, the oldest church in western Ukraine, dating to the 12th century, which I visited. In contrast, this image, next slide please, from the 1970s depicts it being used as a storage facility with a pile of grain on the floor, a pile of corn in the back, and tobacco leaves strung out for drying. This contemporary image, next slide please, is of the 1589 synagogue in Shevchenko, while this image, next slide please, depicts it having been transformed into a place of commerce, a fruit juice making business with large vats in the interior. Here, next slide please, it is depicted with the red star on the building crest and signage reading, "Our place of business, our pride." Lastly, this contemporary image, next slide please, depicts the 16th century church of St. Nicholas in Zolochiv being transformed from a sacred place of worship, next slide please, to a museum of atheism. All of these houses of worship had religious and cultural objects which were slated for destruction. After their buildings would have been shuttered by the authorities, many residents saved these objects for destruction, hiding them away for decades underneath the floorboards, in the attics, in the haylofts, and in the caves. Many were returned to the houses of worship once Ukraine declared independence in 1991. Others that were not able to be immediately saved were discarded outside of the buildings to be burned, such as the polychrome sculptures typically found in Polish Roman Catholic churches. Next slide, please. During the 1950s and 1960s, Boris Vernadsky, a courageous curator from the Lviv National Art Gallery, traveled throughout the regions and rescued, next slide please, over 1,200 Renaissance and Baroque polychrome sculptures from these affected sites, which are located today in the former Capuchin monastery in Olesko. Many of these works are unstable, with a significant insect presence in the facility. This situation is not due to lack of knowledge or diligence on the part of Ukrainian curators or conservators. It is due to the lack of resources to fully protect the work. Vernadsky's rescue efforts also led to an important discovery, such as the work of Johann Georg Pinzel. Next slide, please. A great Baroque carving master. The Louvre organized an exhibition of his work. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, during Vernadsky's decades-long efforts in rescuing these artifacts, the masonry and wooden houses of worship which house these artifacts suffered extensive damage from deliberate, purposeful neglect by the Ukrainian Soviet government, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. The following period photograph, next slide please, depicts the altarpiece of the All Saints Roman Catholic Church in Horodovice, circa 1751, which housed Pinzel's Abraham sacrificing Isaac. Compare it to the church interior today. Next slide, please. Lastly, here's an example of the present-day neglect of the interior of the 1613 Tzarkva of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross in Drohobych. Next slide, please. A candidate for future inclusion into the UNESCO World Heritage Site list, which has been closed to the public for over 80 years. Unfortunately, the current war prevented my returning to Ukraine this summer to continue with this conservation and historic preservation project. These two concepts of conservation and historic preservation bring us to today. Next slide, please. Thus far, I have spoken of the creation of culture and its destruction. Now, I would like to introduce two other powerful forces which have become increasingly important to Ukraine since its independence in 1991. The modern concepts of conservation and historic preservation. These concepts have existed in Ukraine since the 19th century. They have become increasingly vital to Ukrainians discovering and engaging with their cultural heritage and identity. Today, they have assumed an existential character due to the recent invasion. As an American of Ukrainian ancestry, I have occasionally followed events in Ukraine over the years from a distance. After running a successful private conservation practice in New York City for many decades, I decided to broaden my horizons by collaborating in the preservation of Ukrainian culture in 2016. I initiated Skype conversations with Professor Mykola Bevs, head of the Department of Architecture and Conservation, next slide please, at the Lviv Polytechnic National University. He was looking to expand his department's existing stone conservation program, next slide please, to include the conservation of wooden architecture and artifacts as well. In addition, he sought to educate his students utilizing a Western model so that they could preserve the 8 UNESCO World Heritage Site wooden tzarkvas on the territory of Ukraine. They distinguished themselves by their highly skilled joinery, innovative structural solutions used in their construction, their iconostases, their stylistic identity in their construction. After numerous conversations, Mykola Bevs extended an invitation and I successfully applied for a Fulbright award. My journey had begun. During my initial visit in 2017 and subsequent visits, I examined several of these tzarkvas. An example, next slide please, is the UNESCO-listed tzarkva of the Descent of the Holy Spirit in Potalich, circa 1502. Pictured with its adjoining bell tower, it is the oldest surviving tzarkva in the Lviv region. Unfortunately, this tripartite ground plan church is unstable at its foundation due to its site orientation, built into a sloping hill. Over centuries, this has affected the stability of its laid stone foundations, necessitating temporary wooden structural supports and beams. Next slide, please. To keep the tzarkva from collapsing. In addition to the early date of its construction, this tzarkva's unique value is in its painted iconostases. Next slide, please. What makes it especially interesting is that an earlier version of this painted iconostasis exists beneath the visible one. Next slide, please. Even in areas of paint loss. As you can see from this image, next slide, please, the interior horizontal timber members are extensively painted, and paint losses and delamination are prevalent. Next slide, please. Due to these issues, this tzarkva underwent recent conservation treatment. Another example, next slide, please, is the 16th century UNESCO-listed tzarkva of St. George in the city of Drohobych. On the day of my visit, the temperature was 31 degrees Fahrenheit, the relative humidity was 46%, and snow was on the ground. These environmental readings emphasized to me that these tzarkvas had survived for centuries in a completely unregulated environment. It is in much better condition than the previous example in Putalych. Next slide, please. Since it has been cared for over the decades and is now a museum. The interior painting is extensive. Next slide, please. Even up to the cupolas. Next slide, please. Even so, a cursory overview also revealed large areas of paint loss and delamination. Next slide, please. Once again, especially prominent on the interior faces of the horizontal timber walls. This delamination is an interesting technical problem. The horizontal structural timbers absorb moisture on their exterior faces, permeating through to the interior painted surfaces, thereby contributing to the delamination and loss of the paint layers. Since water damage is of significant concern regarding these tzarkvas, it was heartening to note that the wood shakes on the roof had recently been partially replaced. Next slide, please. Utilizing softwood timbers riven traditionally. I encountered a different situation at the Lviv Polytechnic National University. Founded in the 19th century by the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, it has a magnificent interior. Next slide, please. Which was in the process of restoration. Students were manually stripping numerous paint overcoat layers and unintentionally damaging the surfaces. Also located within the building was the original faculty library. Next slide, please. With beautifully executed woodwork and ceiling. These original surfaces required treatment as well. Yet how could I proceed with treatment recommendations when there were no microscopes or other instrumentation? That was a challenge. It was at that point that I realized that if the ambition of Professor Bevs and his faculty was to preserve Ukraine's cultural heritage utilizing a Western model, my Fulbright visits would only be the beginning of a much longer process. What was truly needed was the adoption of a more scientific attitude towards conservation, upgrading their conservation curriculum, adoption of a code of ethics, and ultimately the realization that art conservation is a profession. Next slide, please. Thus, my Fulbright visits became the foundation of much broader efforts. I wrote out my lectures in English, then translated and delivered them in Ukrainian, since most of the conservation students' English language skills were modest. However, the students did have superb eye and hand skills. Next slide, please. In the image on the left, a student is copying a portrait in oil. In the image on the right, in egg tempera. One can build on that level of skill. In addition to lecturing, a 19th century chandelier was chosen as a student project. Next slide, please. The students began by examining this object and preparing condition reports. On a second visit, I brought one of my microscopes. Next slide, please. To introduce students to microscopic wood identification. They were eager to take advantage of my English language skills, so we spent many late afternoons in city museums discussing works of art, incorporating English language conservation terminology. Realizing that the science portion of their education should be strengthened, I lobbied for the introduction of 2 years of chemistry in their bachelor's degree program and a separate year of advanced materials analysis in their master's degree program. Professor Bevs incorporated these suggestions last autumn. And when I returned, and when I learned that their department was creating a conservation lab, the first university art conservation lab in Ukraine, I donated the digital microscope that I brought with me. Another aspect of my visit also came into focus, which was the broader attitude towards historic preservation. Next slide, please. I realized that the faculty needed support, since there was a lax enforcement of existing landmark preservation laws due to the corruption of the judicial system. In this image, the graffiti on the metal fence reads, "This is how the city of Lviv is being destroyed." I later learned that behind the metal fence was a beautiful 19th century Italianate villa. The villa had been purchased with the goal of evicting the current tenants, leveling the structure, and erecting a modern apartment building in its place. However, concerned citizens successfully petitioned the city and had the building designated a historic landmark. Even so, over time, the tenants were forcibly evicted, and despite ongoing picketing and protests, the building was bulldozed in the middle of the night. In light of this situation, and seeing the general neglect of architecture and works of art, I decided to step outside of my assigned role as a visiting instructor and speak up publicly. My support for historic preservation at conferences, meetings, and in the press and on television culminated in an address to Ukraine's parliament. Next slide, please. Where I advocated for increased funding for historic preservation. Since then, next slide, please, events in Ukraine have taken a drastic turn for the worse, and the country is battling for its very life as a separate, independent nation. The graffiti I encountered 4 years ago, "This is how the city of Lviv is being destroyed," was now a sample of what affects the whole country. And we in the West are witnessing that destruction. Ukrainian museums were unprepared for the invasion, many not having what Ukrainians refer to as red lists, lists of their most significant artifacts created to ensure the safeguarding of their most important holdings. Neither did the museums have sufficient quantities of packing materials and other resources necessary to move their treasures to safer locations. In order to aid Ukraine in this crisis, my colleagues and I concentrated on preparing an artwork packing materials list, securing funding, and having the essential items shipped in boxcars to Ukraine. These packed items were distributed, the artworks packed, and then moved to safer locations. Specialized fire extinguishers filled with distilled water were then made available to protect wooden churches. Monuments were also protected, such as this 1828 statue of Duke de Richelieu, governor of Odessa, a symbol of the city. Even so, as of June 24, there were 397 damaged or destroyed architectural monuments in Ukraine, including 238 churches, 18 libraries, 49 theaters, and 116 cultural heritage sites. And the list keeps growing every day. Here are some images of that destruction. Next slide, please. This is the Church of the Ascension in Lukashivka, Chernihiv region. Next slide, please. The Skovoroda Museum, located on the former 18th century estate of the noted Ukrainian philosopher Grigory Skovoroda, is highly symbolic to many Ukrainians as the individual who promoted Socrates' famous dictum, know thyself. Next slide, please. The Donetsk Regional Drama Theater in Mariupol was the site of theatrical productions, lectures, workshops, demonstrations that embody what UNESCO calls the intangible cultural heritage. Next slide, please. The Regional Children's Library that was housed in the former building circa 1896 of the Taranushenko Museum of Ukrainian Antiquities, which has one of the largest holdings of Ukrainian Kazakhstan, numbering over 10,000. Next slide, please. This last image is especially compelling. 4 days after the beginning of the invasion, numerous works by Ukrainian folk artist Maria Primachenko in the collection of Ivankiv Historical and Local Museum, northwest of the capital of Kyiv, were destroyed. She was recognized throughout Ukraine as a symbol of the nation's creativity, being awarded the Taranushenko National Prize of Ukraine, the highest cultural award one can achieve in that country, and being an inspiration for many, including Picasso. Why was such a small, unimposing museum purposefully targeted, since no other buildings were destroyed in its vicinity? What did President Putin most fear about her art, her demeanor, her being? The answer is possibly best reflected in her own words. Once, as a young girl, I was tending a gaggle of geese when I got with them to a sandy beach. Next slide, please. On the bank of a river, after crossing a field dotted with wildflowers, I began to draw real and imaginary flowers. Later, I decided to paint the walls of my house using natural pigments. After that, I never stopped drawing and painting. So what can be done? Next slide, please. Share your knowledge and expertise. Everyone has a field of expertise. See if you can put it to good use. Speaking for myself, I redoubled my efforts to improve the state of conservation education in Ukraine, realizing that once hostilities end, all of the damaged artifacts will need to be conserved. That meant organizing a translation of a significant Getty publication, conservation text, into Ukrainian, and the beginning of an English-Ukrainian glossary of conservation terms. Next slide, please. Communicate. Help the millions of Ukrainians displaced by the war to navigate the wider world. As an example of my efforts, and with the assistance of Tatyana Timchenko, head of the Conservation Department at the National Academy of Fine Arts and Architecture in Kyiv, and her students, I created Blue Sky, a secure Telegram messaging site to connect Ukrainian conservators with their English-speaking colleagues. This initiative introduced refugee conservators and conservation students to IIC, the International Institute for Conservation in London, broadening their worldview and advancing their education. Next slide, please. Secure funding for various initiatives. As a result of my various postings, colleagues have donated funds for the purchase of conservation materials, since in Ukraine, students supply all materials, including the most basic ones. In addition, two major initiatives are on the horizon. One is to digitally scan the over 2,500 wooden churches in Ukraine, including their interiors, like the ones you've seen in this presentation. This effort would document their present state and in doing so create a vital link to the nation's past. An important consideration should these churches be destroyed by the war. Our knowledge of Ukraine's cultural history would be infinitely inferior today without the photographs and documentation of Alwa Bruyere and Stefan Taranushenko, who I mentioned previously. The second initiative is to procure funding for comprehensive conservation education programs in Ukraine, including additional translations of texts into Ukrainian, visiting professorships and workshops, and the establishment of sophisticated art conservation labs. I urge you to support the preservation of Ukrainian culture at this time of its great need, so that the citizens of Ukraine can discover it, extend it, and in doing so, become themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. I think that this was a fascinating presentation. Let me turn the lights on and we'll go through our question and answer session. I wanted Yuri to share, because he grew up in this area, he wanted maybe to share a little bit about what first motivated him into this line of work.
Thank you, Oda. So, one of the aspects of becoming a conservator is that one has to acquire a large body of knowledge from various disciplines. So typically a conservator today means one is educated both in the scientific aspect of the materials that one works with, such as in my case, it is wood, and also one acquires the manual skills necessary to be able to execute various procedures necessary to conserve works of art made of wood. In my case, it means having a tremendous and very varied skills of woodworking. So the marriage of both of those become a prerequisite for becoming an accomplished conservator. And for me, the ability to acquire that knowledge over time meant that I in fact acquired a master's degree in fine arts. I studied at the Smithsonian for the scientific aspects of wood conservation. I studied with wood anatomists so that I would be able to microscopically recognize various woods. So for example, we have a collection in our studio of over 500 different woods from throughout the world. It becomes extremely necessary in identifying marquetry, for example, very prominent in the 18th century, both in France and in England. Those kinds of skills, and as well having the introduction and the knowledge of the different styles that art history has given us over time, becomes a necessary skill in becoming an effective conservator.
I think you wanted to mention too this Shevchenko's inspiration.
So when I was growing up here in Detroit, my father had ordered books of drawings of Ukraine's bard, Taras Shevchenko. And when they arrived from Ukraine, we were flipping through the books and we came upon this watercolor by him. And we talked a little bit about that, and my father, from memory, recited his famous poem of Suboti. So for me, this was interesting because on my Fulbright visit to Ukraine, I was asked to authenticate the balcony in this church, the Church of Saint Yuri in Suboti. So that connection between what had happened over 50, 60 years ago in my childhood and what happened later in my life, that became exceedingly interesting and very moving.
Does anybody have any questions? Marika?
What's the polychrome statue?
What are the polychrome statues?
Polychrome statues are basically, in this particular case, statues that are carved out of wood and then painted. So that's what polychromy means, various colors of paint on a wooden surface.
Dr. Julie had a question earlier.
You had mentioned, you had described the Soviet destruction of Ukrainian churches in eastern Ukraine in the earlier 20th century, and then you showed a synagogue that had been destroyed. Was there, in your opinion, was there a Soviet destruction of religious structures? Was it equal for the Jewish community and Ukrainian communities, or were they more violent against Ukrainian communities, or did it matter to the Soviets?
You know, what is interesting, of course, is that in the 20th century, what we witnessed was, in fact, the destruction of Ukrainian cultural artifacts, whether it was by a totalitarian regime, the Soviet regime, or by a racist museum based on racial ideology, that is the Nazis. So both of those entities, those political entities, wanted to destroy religion and, in fact, people as well. So in this presentation, we're focusing on the artifacts, the destruction of the artifacts that these people had created. So in both cases, tremendous damage was done. And it's only now in the 21st century that Ukrainians have started the process of coming to terms with that trauma of that cultural destruction. And they were very well in that process until the war began. And so what we have today is a extension of that damage. And that's why, once again, the Ukrainian people, that is the citizens of Ukraine, ethnic Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, Jews, Tatars, a multi-ethnic, multicultural nation where when one uses the phrase Ukrainian, one thinks of it in terms of a civic identity. A person would say, I am a Jew, like the current president, but I'm a Ukrainian patriot. So that's the important distinction. And that evolution of thinking happened truly over only in the past 10 years or so, but primarily due to the revolution of dignity at the Maidan in 2014.
I think Donna had a question.
Yeah. You showed a few slides of the churches that have the UNESCO World Heritage designation. I was wondering, with that designation, is there any funding that's associated for preservation efforts?
Unfortunately not. So for example, the church that the photograph of the church that I had shown at the very end, the exaltation of the Holy Cross in Terhovich from 1613, the initial conservation efforts, that is just the documentation of that church, was privately funded. And there is no money available yet for the second phase, which would be the conservation of that church. That church is important because it is the only Ukrainian church where the paintings still exist in the sacristy. A very important aspect, because no other church has that. And so the funding for that portion of the conservation of the church still needs to be found. And these are expensive projects, because even for the initial documentation portion of it, it meant having specialists come out from the United States, take samples of the paint surfaces, analyze them, perform microscopic wood identification, having the church digitally scanned on the exterior and interior, both with scanners, high-end scanners on tripods, as well as high-resolution camera scanners on drones, to fully document the church, and then that information being transformed into working drawings, so that should something happen to that church, that potential knowledge is not lost. It's very important that we understand that those archives that I mentioned earlier, Stepan Taranushenko's, there are over 1,000 photographs of destroyed Ukrainian churches. And the only reason we know about them is because of those photographs.
You mentioned Pinzel. I believe, I don't know unless I'm mistaken, in Lviv there is a church that houses quite a number of his sculptures that remain intact. I can't remember the name.
Right, so there is a Pinzel museum of many of the sculptures in Lviv, and there's also the most famous sculpture that many Ukrainians will immediately recognize, which is at the top of St. George's Cathedral in Lviv. When you look at the iconic sculpture of St. George slaying the dragon that's on top of that cathedral, that is the work of Gerard Pinzel.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about the actual process of preservation and conservation? And when you were in Ukraine, were you able to work with artifacts? And if so, did you have access to materials, tools? What's the story there? I know there's no funding for it. It's a relatively new science now, as you mentioned. Were you able to work there with things and had what you needed to do so?
We were able to work with them, but for example, I personally, for my own firm, funded the materials for many of the efforts.
Right.
I brought my own microscopes. And in fact, I paid for my students to travel with me to Krakow, Poland, where there was a once in 4 years conference of student conservation students, so that they would be introduced to their fellow colleagues in Europe. And it was quite a shock for Ukrainian students because they did not possess the English language skills necessary to communicate effectively. And of course, they did not have the chemistry background, which meant they were not able to understand the technical aspects of conservation. So all of that is being addressed today. And unfortunately, the war has merely slowed down that process. But on a positive note, since so many Ukrainian young conservation students are refugees now in Europe, through my efforts, many of those students have now been accepted into European conservation programs. So they are being introduced to the techniques, the modern conservation techniques that are so necessary to effectively preserve Ukrainian culture, and that's a huge plus. So there are pluses from this war. And in fact, I'm very hopeful that when these students return to Ukraine and hostilities end, they will come back with an increased knowledge base, and more importantly, the contacts that they have made in Europe and in the United States to increase their knowledge and to realize that they are not alone in this process, that there are other individuals who are ready and willing to help.
There's a painting that went up all of a sudden at the wall on the second floor by a Ukrainian painter, and I was looking through my photographs and I can't find the name. And he was from Mariupol originally, a turn of the century, in the 19th to the 20th. And he eventually lived in St. Petersburg, but he was originally from Mariupol. And after about a month into the war, I was going through and I noticed this painting. All of a sudden, they had it in storage. There was a museum housing just his paintings in Mariupol, and that was completely destroyed.
Are you thinking of Iconostasis?
No, I can't remember. I will find the name, but I just actually was looking through my phone trying to find the enlarged word. It was a very unusual name. But I was just wondering to what extent some things like that are occurring. In other words, if paintings, or it doesn't apply to churches per se, are owned by museums or institutions in the West, where they could be displayed or possibly could be returned. I mean, it's part of a sort of effort to save these things, because the museum in Mariupol is completely destroyed. And that's on the explanation next to the painting.
You know, I think that's a great question because it involves not only the current war, but you have to understand that in the 20s and 30s, when I was showing all of the photographs of the destroyed iconostases from eastern Ukraine, well, Stalin sold off icons and artifacts to American collectors. And those items are here, but they are not well researched. So that is an issue that still needs to be addressed and will be addressed because a young art historian from Ukraine has applied for a Fulbright to come here to the States and research that very topic. I can give you two examples. One are the royal doors, two sets of them, which were exhibited in the United States, and one of which now is in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the other is presumably in the collection of the Hammer Collection at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Another example are the liturgical vestments of the Lavra clergy. This collection was exhibited in St. Louis in 1950. Another aspect of Ukrainians' cultural heritage, as all of you well know by looking at the wonderful examples here in the museum, Ukrainians have a wonderful love of textiles. So those textiles, those liturgical vestments, are someplace here. And there are more because not everything is in institutional public collections. They are in private collections that are not publicly available. And those collections exist because I have seen them. I have personally seen a collection of over 300 icons, 20 of which came from iconostasis. So that needs to be documented. The connections need to be made between those icons, which iconostasis they came from. It's a huge project. So there's a lot of work to be done. And of those three areas of destruction that I mentioned in the 20th century, those three areas are completely under-researched. A lot of work still needs to be done.
Martha? It's just like those things were taken and preserved even by Ukrainian citizens themselves during the war. Do you have a sense that that's happening now? That people are going into religious places and citizens themselves in an attempt to preserve are going in and trying to hide or save these items?
You know, the situation today in Ukraine is vastly different than it was in the 20th century. The difference, of course, is that Ukraine has matured as a nation. So there are institutions that have gone in, for example, and taken the initiative to preserve Ukrainian cultural heritage. There are many websites that you can visit and donate money to, for example. Websites that are and groups of individuals who are very active in the preservation efforts. So it's not like it was in the 20th century where you have to rely on individuals to do this. Now it's groups of individuals who potentially become organized, who apply for funding from the West, and lots of funding has in fact been given to Ukraine to preserve its cultural heritage. I can single out the Prince Claus Fund, who's donated hundreds of thousands of dollars for the preservation of Ukrainian culture. Not to mention all of the volunteer activity to preserve Ukraine's digital information, part of which includes its cultural heritage. So Ukraine today is recognized as a separate independent country, and individuals are stepping up to help it in its time of need. So that's extremely positive.
Is it possible that inclusion into the EU could help illuminate these works of art and motivation towards restoration, or is it just a political designation without any, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think it would be very, very positive for Ukraine to join the EU, because it's not just a question of money. It's also a question of transparency and good governance, and also the knowledge base that is necessary for Ukrainians to conserve their heritage. So, for example, when I initiate a program or a translation of a major Getty conservation text into Ukrainian, that knowledge then becomes usable. It's very difficult for Ukrainians to understand concepts that we take for granted because they don't have the English language skills necessary to absorb the knowledge and the procedures and everything else that comes with the conservation process. So it's a process that will take some time, but it is well on its way.
Okay.
The private collections that we mentioned, when we were talking the other day, when Michelle was selling us our stuff. But how can we go and try to research that? That's the question. I mean, like you said, you saw some private collections, but to access over here, how would you start looking for that stuff?
Well, that is, first of all, truly the job of art historians who are completely familiar with the buying and selling history of these artifacts, which means being able to access the archives and the repositories of the buying and selling auction records. Not only that, but many of these items were privately sold. So one has to gain access to that information. And that is, of course, a challenge in its own right, because many of these sales were extremely private. As you may or may not well know, the art world is a huge private business. Not everything is fully documented. Many works of art are sold today completely privately. Works of art change hands, and it's no different than it was at the time when those items were, in fact, sold by Stalin to wealthy collectors outside of the then Soviet Union. One aspect of my presentation is, of course, that we would love to get your engagement in the preservation process. And there is an initiative by the co-sponsors of this presentation, the Detroit branch, of the Shevechenko Scientific Society, and it's called the Shevchenko Emergency Fund. And it is to fund scholarships and grants to Ukrainian diaspora artists, researchers, scholars, and I, in fact, have agreed to read the applications of approximately 50 of those. And the number of applications up to this point numbers over 250. So there's a huge need to assist these individuals. But if you're interested in giving, that's not the only venue that's available to you today. So another venue is, in fact, that project that I had mentioned about digitally scanning the over 2,500 Ukrainian churches. One aspect of Ukrainian culture is that most every single village had a wooden church. And that church was maintained over centuries by the local craftsmen who knew that church intimately and were able to prevent any major damage. In the 20th century, that damage occurred because those individuals were shuttered off from that process of maintaining those churches. Each one of those churches represents a unique moment of Ukrainian creativity, and they are not, for the most part, documented. Only the most important churches are documented. So, what happens to all these other ones should they be destroyed by the war? What you will then have will be an irreparable loss of Ukrainian culture. So that's kind of like another possible venue that you could donate money to. And I should mention the third one, which is, of course, this wonderful institution that invited me to speak today. So I would love to ask all of you not to leave today without making a donation to at least one of those three venues, and in so doing, preserving Ukraine's cultural heritage. Thank you very much for coming.